Hey there, students. This is Mr. Taylor back at it again with a new chapter. Today we're starting chapter 11 on the muscular system. So, if you watched the last three videos, those were all about muscle tissue, which is kind of like how the muscle cells work. But now we're going to start looking at the whole muscles, how they work, how they're named, what they do, where they are, that kind of thing. All right, so let's get started. So, when we look at muscle structure, we find out that each one of your skeletal muscles, all seven or 800 of them, are each considered to be an independent organ. So, for example, like your biceps brachii, your quadriceps, your abs are all organs because, by definition, an organ is a group of tissues working together for a common purpose. So, all of your skeletal muscles are made of skeletal muscle tissue, but they also have vascular tissue to provide blood. They have nervous tissue to control them and help them to feel. And they have connective tissue that we talked about in the last chapter that wrap them up and connect them onto the bones. So they are considered to be organs. When we look at a skeletal muscle, they have a couple different parts that are important to understand. And these are really important because we're going to use these a lot when we name the muscles. The first part of a skeletal muscle is called the origin. And this is where the muscle attaches to a bone that it doesn't move, to a stationary bone. So, for example, if you think about like your biceps brachii, this is the biceps, the one that flexes your arm at the elbow. It bends your arm at the elbow, it pulls your forearm up and closer to your upper arm, but it doesn't move your shoulder or your upper arm. Those stay put. So your biceps, because it's connected onto your scapula or your shoulder bone, that is its origin. The insertion is the attachment of the muscle to the bone that it moves. So in the case of your biceps, it hooks onto your radius and it pulls the radius up towards your shoulder. So the radius would be its insertion. Some muscles, these switch back and forth because it can move one or the other, but most of your muscles have one origin and one insertion. Some of them can have a couple of origins or insertions depending on where they're located. In between the origin and insertion, we have the belly, and the belly is the main part of the muscle that kind of like bulges out sometimes. It's the part that has most of the skeletal muscle tissue. So we call that the fleshy part, but it's contractile. It does all the contraction. Uh, so in your biceps, you can think about this as the part that kind of like sticks up in the middle and bulges out from under the skin a little bit. The tendons are the part that connect the belly to the origin and insertion. So the muscle pulls on the tendons, the tendon pulls on the bones at the origin and insertion. And then the last term is this thing called an aponeurosis, which we don't use that much, but it comes up every once in a while. And an aponeurosis is just like a really large, wide, flat tendon. So it's the same as a tendon. It's like, the connective tissue that connects the muscle onto a bone, but it's just very large and flat. So here's our diagram of our biceps that we were talking about. And you can see here's the belly in the middle. Here are the tendons on the end, kind of drawn in white, and that's the standard that we use. And then you can see here's the insertion on the radius, and here is the origins up here on top of this is your coracoid process up here. And we actually have another one that wraps around over top of the head of the humerus. Great. And if you look at the triceps, same type of thing. The triceps has a couple bellies here. It's got its insertion down here on the ulna, on the olecranon, if you want to be specific, and it's got its origins up here on the scapula. Okay, so if you've ever gone to the gym and looked at any of the machinery in the gym, they usually tell you what muscle groups you're working. So it'll say, oh, this machine does the biceps and the triceps or whatever. And the reason why these exercises use many different muscles at the same time is because muscles always work at groups. So most of your muscles, when they're doing something, they require kind of like a team approach in order to do whatever action you're trying to achieve. So the first member of our group of muscles is what's called a prime mover or an agonist. And this is the muscle that does the thing that we're trying to do. So for example, let's say I wanted to flex my arm at the elbow. You could say that the biceps does that, but there's also another muscle called the brachialis, which is right underneath the biceps that also bends the arm at the elbow. And it turns out that anatomically we consider the brachialis to be the prime mover, the agonist, because that's its job. Its job is simply to bend the arm at the elbow. The biceps helps with that, but it does a couple other things too, so it's not considered the prime mover. The opposite of the agonist is the antagonist that does the opposite effect. So if your brachialis is flexing your arm at the elbow, when you extend your arm, that's like the opposite movement. So that's done by the antagonist known as the triceps. So if we go back for a minute and look at this picture, we don't have a picture of the brachialis here, but we'll use the biceps as the example. The biceps is on one side of the humerus, and it's going to bend the arm. It's going to flex the arm at the elbow. And if you look at the triceps, it's going to extend the arm at the elbow. Notice they're on opposite sides of the humerus. That's generally true. So usually you have an agonist and an antagonist that are paired on opposite sides of the body. So if you think about your leg, it's the exact same thing, except you're going to have like quads on the front and you're going to have hamstrings on the back. They're going to act as antagonists. The third group is called synergists. And actually, this is where the biceps actually comes in. It is a synergist to the brachialis. It helps the agonist. It helps does the same movement, but it also helps to reduce some extra motion. So if you've ever noticed, if you do an activity, especially like lifting weights, and you do it a couple times, and after a certain number of reps, you'll notice that all of a sudden you become really shaky. Like the same movement you're trying to do very smoothly at the beginning, as you get tired, you start to like quiver and shake a little bit. That's because the prime mover is getting tired, and the synergists that were before just kind of helping to reduce that extra motion and make everything nice and smooth, now they take over and they start to get tired and they start to lose that ability to reduce the extra motion. The last group is called fixators, and these help to stabilize the origin. And so, if you think about it, if you pick up something really heavy, you're using your arms to lift it, but you're also using your abs to kind of like tighten up your chest so you don't like lean forward. If you do any sort of exercise, you have to maintain your posture and your position, and those are the roles of the fixators. Basically, these are like your core muscles. They're going to kind of help to like tighten up your core, hold your torso in place. Okay. Another thing to talk about when it comes to muscles are the levers systems that they form. And so basically, if you look at your joints and your bones and your muscles all together, they form a couple different lever systems. And this is going to get very physicsy, but it's not bad. So basically, when we look at the lever systems in the body, their job is to either increase your speed, which is the most common. So they like increase the distance that something moves, increase its speed, or they multiply force, which is kind of rarer, believe it or not, in your body. So there's three different classes of levers, and they look like this. So there's first class, second class, and third class levers. The first class lever, if you look at it, it's set up so that we have a fulcrum or a pivot point like this. That's what this little triangle is in the middle between the weight or load and the force being applied. So an example of this in your body is down here. It's your head pivoting on your neck. So you have your fulcrum in the middle, you have the weight of your head pulling down, and then to prevent it from going down, you have a muscle in the back of your neck called the trapezius that pulls down to raise your head up. So basically, the force in this instance is going in the opposite direction of the intended movement. So as you lift your head up, the muscle is pulling down. And an example of this would be like pliers. So when you push down in one direction, the bottom jaw of the pliers comes up, and you have a great mechanical advantage here. Great. So going back for a second, let's look at this. So we say it's kind of like a seesaw. So we have a joint between the muscle and the load, like a seesaw. It's used to multiply force usually. Your triceps is another example of this. If you look at how your triceps is set up, it is set up with being on the back side of your elbow joint, and it pulls up to move your arm out and straight. Second class levers are a bit different. These are kind of like a wheelbarrow. And so in this case, we have our fulcrum up in the front, we have our weight or our load in the middle, and then we have our force at the end. And the force is going to pull up against the weight of this object, and the object is going to move in the same direction. So an example of this would be kind of like your bottle opener. Another example of this is like a wheelbarrow. So you have like the wheel in the front, your weight in the middle, and then you lift up on the arms of the wheelbarrow. This is what your body uses, for example, in your feet. So all of your weight is pivoting on your toes. Um, your gastrocnemius, they say triceps surae, but still, the gastrocnemius is the muscle that we call it. Your calf muscle is going to pull up on your heel against your body weight and lift it up. This is also similar to like when you do a push-up. If you think about it, when you do a push-up, you have your feet on the ground, so your feet stay on the ground. You are exerting force up here with your arms, and your body weight is in the middle. So a very similar lever system. Oops. And if we go back, you can see it's like a wheelbarrow, usually multiplies force, standing your tiptoes, doing push-ups, like we said. And then the third class lever, these are really common in the body. Third class lever, this is where we have our joint or our fulcrum on one end, similar to the second class lever. But now we put our force closer to the fulcrum and we put our load farther away out at the end. And this is a speed or distance multiplier. So any sort of tool you've ever used, like a long handle tool, like a shovel or a rake, or even a broom, actually, you're using a third class lever. And that's why you do it, is it makes it like faster and more efficient. So in your body, your biceps, for example, when it's pulling on your radius, it's pulling here in the middle. Here's our fulcrum. Here's our little pivot point here at the joint, and the resistance is all the way out here at your arm. So believe it or not, when you're lifting something heavy with your biceps, you're actually exerting a lot more force because the biceps is set up to increase your speed. It's making your arms faster, not stronger, which is pretty crazy. So if we go back, third class lever, muscles between the joint and the load. Baseball bat's another example, or softball bat. You swing on one end, and then you have this long bat sticking out, and you're applying force on the far end of the bat. It makes the bat go a lot faster. So the longer your bat, the more bat speed you can get, assuming that bats all weigh the same amount. Brooms, same type of thing. They're force dividers or speed multipliers, as some other teachers might tell you. Great. So that's it for levers, but this is just kind of something, it's neat to know. All right. So this is the really, really important stuff. The most important thing for us to understand is how we name our muscles. And muscle names come from a lot of different sources. I'm going to kind of break them down for you. The trick is to learn how these work so you don't have to just memorize a bunch of names. All right, so the first way that we can name our muscles is based off of their actions, aka what do they do? And if you look at this list, this should look really familiar to you because these are pretty much the same things we learned in the joints chapter. So the same movements at joints are going to come back again. So for example, flexor and extensor. If you remember, to flex means to decrease an angle at a joint, to extend means to increase the angle at a joint. And so that's what these muscles do. We have the adductor or adductor and abductor or abductor, and these do exactly what you think they would do from the joints chapter. Adduct, adductor, you add together, so it brings the body parts closer to the body midline. Ab or abductors are going to move away from the body's midline, or they're going to spread. So when you spread your arms, spread your legs, spread your fingers, you are abducting or abducting. A tensor applies tension, so it tightens something up. So you have a couple muscles that have this in their name because that's their basic purpose. Levator means to elevate. I don't know why they dropped the E off of here, but it's something that's going to lift something or raise it. A depressor, of course, is the opposite. It's going to depress or lower something. A supinator, if you remember some of the special movements at joints, supinate meant to flip your palms up. So you actually have a muscle in your arm called the supinator, which actually does that. It flips your hand so it's facing palm up. And the opposite of that is pronation, which is to flip your palm down. And that's what your pronator does. You actually have a couple pronators in your forearms that do this. And the last one is the sphincter, which a lot of people think is some sort of dirty word for some reason. A sphincter is a muscle that closes or opens an opening. So when it constricts or contracts, it closes an opening, and when it relaxes, it opens it back up. You have tons of sphincters in your body. You have a whole bunch, like the pupil of your eye, the iris of the eye. The iris is actually a sphincter muscle. You have sphincters in your capillaries. You have sphincters in your digestive tract. Of course, there's the anal sphincter, and these things all are used to control the size of an opening. Another way we can name muscles is based off their direction. So the first one, rectus, means like vertical. Like if you erect something, you build it up and down. So that's where we get rectus from. Transverse, if you remember, the transverse plane was horizontal from left to right. So that's where we get that from. And of course, oblique is any other angle that's not rectus or transverse. When we look at size, we get these Latin words like maximus, magnus, major, vastus, which all means big or biggest. So they're telling you it's a large muscle. Minimus would mean it's small or the smallest muscle. If something's longus or longissimus, longus means long and longissimus means longest. And then latissimus means wide, like latitude. It's like a wide area. All right, and then we can also talk about the shape of muscles. So some of these are pretty easy, some of these are a little bit tricky. So if a muscle has a triangular shape, like a river delta or like the Greek letter delta, it's a triangle, so it's deltoid. If we have a trapezoidal shaped muscle, we call it trapezius. If it's shaped like a saw, kind of like jagged and has like sharp edges, we call it serratus. So think of like a serrated knife, or like the Sierra Nevadas, they're kind of like sharp and pointy. Rhomboid is like a rhombus, so it's got kind of like a diamond shape to it. Orbicularis, like an orb, is circular. Platus, like platypus, right, is a flat muscle. You actually have a muscle called the platysma, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that's really thin and flat. Quadratus would be like a square, like a quadrilateral. And then gracilis is slender. And I always think of gracilis as being like graceful and slim. We can also name a muscle off of how many origins it has. And if you forgot about this already, an origin is where a muscle attaches onto a part of your body that does not move. So the biceps, like the biceps brachii, has two origins that two places it attaches that don't move. The triceps has three origins, so that's how it gets its name. So bi, tri, and then the quadriceps has four origins. So you can imagine if there was one with five, it would be like a quinticeps or something like that. Anyway. We can also name muscles based off their location. So if you think about all the anatomical terms, like your temporal region, for example, there's a muscle called temporalis because that's where you find it. And then similar to that, you can name muscles based off of their origin and insertion, aka like what they're attached to. Like there's a muscle called the occipitofrontalis, and you can guess just by looking at its name that it connects your occipital bone to your frontal bone. And so just knowing its name tells you exactly where you're going to find it. So if you see like two anatomical regions put together into a word, it's basically telling you the origin and insertion. Hey, guess what? That is it for this video. So hopefully you guys learned a lot about naming muscles. In the next 3 videos, we're going to learn all about the different muscles of the body. All right, see you later.